Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to my series where we go through reading Vermont, not Reading, Vermont, not the tiny hamlet in Windsor County, but reading Vermont, where I go through the big pile of used books that I got the last time I was up at the little old farmhouse in Vermont visiting Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads. We went used book hunting every day that I was up there. It was an enormous amount of fun, and I came back with a gigantic lung-high pile of books. The stack of books was just that high, and I broke them up into columns, and I put them neatly on the floor at the foot of a bookcase in the other room, thinking that the next time I went up to Vermont and we did more egregious used book shopping, including the Five Colleges book sale, where I would certainly have got 100 books, I would then use that as an excuse to move out and reshelve all of that first batch and put the second batch on the floor, and I would just use that as a station for all of my Vermont book hauls. And then the world changed, and then that became temporarily impossible. I can look forward to the day when I go up to the old farmhouse with me and the bean and we shop for books again. But in the meantime, I thought I'd better address that stack of books on the floor, because I know that I've been receiving pushback from some of you on this point, but nevertheless, Steve is right, because Steve is always right. Books stacked on the floor is a sign of defeat. you must find room on your shelves for your books. If you start to stack books on the floor, you're not going to stop. They're going to just grow there like kudzu. So I've been going through those books, and I thought as long as I'm going through them, I might as well talk to you about them. So we're going to do one today, and it's a murder mystery. This is the 2005 novel The Lighthouse by P.D. James in this great UK trade paperback. I now have two P.D. James in these UK trade paperbacks, and I wish I had them all. I love them. I just love the whole. I think this is Faber and Faber. I love the whole feel of them. The stock of paper, the type of binding, the actual dimensions. I like it so much better than the trade paperback of this novel that came out in America. And this stars Inspector Adam Dalgleish, who is P.D. James's main character, and it stars his team, his crack team of Scotland Yard investigators. And in this book, they are called to an island off the Cornish coast, which has been a sort of a shishi retreat for wealthy people, including critically respected but extremely disliked novelist who is found dead. He's found hanging from the island's famous iconic lighthouse, hence the title of the book. And it of course looks like suicide because he's hanging, but because it is odd, because it is unusual, nothing like this ever happens in this colony. The standing instructions for the inhabitants, the few inhabitants of the island, was that if anything like this, anything just outre and unbelievable like this were to happen, you call Scotland Yard. You don't call the local constabulary, you call the professionals to come in and investigate. And one of the characters in this book does that, and that sets in motion Dalgleish and his team to go to this island. And the character's decision to do that is not received well by some of the other characters. The book engages in some very skillful foreshadowing by having lots of the characters on the island talk about the coming visit of these Scotland Yard inspectors before we see the inspectors, before the inspectors get there. That's very good. That's a very good device if you can do it well. Well, of course, the most famous example being Herman Melville's Moby Dick, where we hear a lot about Captain Ahab before we actually meet him. But let's see here. I want to give you a little bit of a taste of this. One of the characters, named Emily, says, let's see here. She questions why this was done, and a character tells her, I think it's because of the importance of the victim and the insistence of the trustees on discretion as much privacy as possible. Whatever this Dalgleish does, it's unlikely to cause the kind of upheaval or publicity which calling the local police force would inevitably produce. And Emily says, but that isn't quite good enough, Rupert. How did the Metropolitan Police get to know that Oliver was dead? Presumably you telephoned them. Why not phone the Devon or Cornwall constabulary? Because, Emily, I have instructions to contact a London number if there's anything worryingly untoward on the island. My understanding is that it's always been the procedure. Yes, but what number? Whose number? I wasn't told whose. My instructions were to report and to say nothing further. I'm sorry, Emily, but that's in line with long-standing arrangements, and I intend to adhere to it. I have adhered to it. Long-standing, she says. It's the first I've heard of it. And the scene goes on, as P.D. James is really good at writing tense scenes in which characters don't like each other and which we don't like any of them. And the scene goes on. I want to get you one last bit. We go on with these characters just mentally fencing with each other. And they talk about the deceased and his nearest and dearest, and whether or not they can be shown the body. I don't know if any of you know what a hanged body looks like. It's not a pretty sight at all. The neck does stretch, and the face. It's not a good thing to see. Let's see here. Emily suggests at one point that the novelist might not have been writing his own books, or that something strange might have been going on. She says, let's see here, that the character Tremlett, he's supposed to be a copy editor and personal assistant, but I think he does a great deal more than copy editing. The novel before the last, The Gravedigger's Daughter, was respectfully but unenthusiastically received. Hardly vintage Nathan Oliver, that's the novelist. Wasn't that the book he finished while Tremlett was in hospital, when they were trying to do something about his leg? Incidentally, what was wrong with it? Stavely's voice was curt. Polio when he was a child, it left him lame. And he's curt because he thinks she's being unfeeling, and she is being unfeeling. Maycroft turned to Emily. You're not suggesting that Tremlett wrote the novels? Of course he doesn't write them. Nathan Oliver does. I'm suggesting that Tremlett fulfills a more important role in Oliver's life than copy editing, however meticulously, that dealing with his fan letters. Gossip has it that Oliver refused ever to be edited by his publishers. Does he need to be? He had Tremlett. And what about Oliver himself? Surely there's no point in pretending that he was a welcome or agreeable guest. I doubt whether there's anyone on the island who actually wishes he were still alive. Guy Stavely had been silent. Now he said, I think it would be sensible to defer discussion until Jo arrives. She shouldn't be long. Adrian will tell her that we're meeting. Emily said, why do we need her? This was supposed to be a meeting of the permanent residents other than supporting staff. Jo hardly qualifies as a full-time resident. Guy Stavely said quietly, she qualifies as my wife. Also in a somewhat part-time capacity. That's Emily saying that. Stavely's face grew suffused with scarlet. He shifted in his chair as if about to rise, but at an appealing glance from Maycroft, sank back. And Maycroft says quietly, we won't get anywhere if we're at each other's throats even before the police arrive. But that's a pretty telling little sally, saying, well, that popular opinion has it that her status as your wife is only part-time as well. That gives you you're fairly early on in the book when you get scenes like that, and it hammers home that no one on this island is particularly nice. It seems like in the course of the early part of the book, it seems like the novelist, the dead man, the one who's found hanging from the lighthouse, was probably the least likable person. No one seems to have liked him at all. No one has a kind word to say about him. But then another person is found dead, and the next person who's found dead is extremely well liked. So that theory goes out the window. But another thing that happens here that I wanted to show you, that I want to read to you, is exposition. I've got to find where I did this here. P.D. James. One of the criticisms leveled against this author, and Elizabeth George even more, is that they're guilty of padding. We get every last little detail of things that don't deserve it, that never come up, never are important in the novel again. I would ordinarily be one of the first people to make that criticism unless the padding is done well. P.D. James is just unbelievably great to read. I would read her just natter on about anything. And as a result of that, I don't think she's guilty, in other words, but she does have that tendency. And one of the hallmarks of that tendency is to bring on characters who just dump exposition. And so we get chunks of exposition. I want to read you one of those to give you a feel for what she's like when she does that. Because here, a sergeant is asking one of the expedition dumpers about manual strangulation. Because it starts to become obvious in the early part of the book that maybe this novelist did not hang himself. Maybe not. So we have to know all about manual strangulation to know whether or not it can simulate hanging. And the exposition dumper says, manual strangulation is one of the most interesting aspects in forensic medicine. It can't, of course, be self-inflicted. Unconsciousness would intervene and the grip would relax. That means strangling is always assumed to be homicidal unless there is a convincing evidence to the contrary. Most strangulation is manual, and we expect to find the marks of the grip on the neck. Sometimes there is scratching or the impression of a fingernail made when the victim is trying to loosen the assailant's grip. There's no evidence of that here. The two almost identical bruises on the left side of the neck over the cornu of the thyroid suggest strongly that this was strangulation by a right-handed adult and that one hand only was used. The pressure between the thumb and finger means that the voice box is squeezed and there may be bruising behind it. In elderly persons, such as this victim, there can be a fracture of the superior cornu of the thyroid at its base. It is only where the grip has been very violent that more extensive fractures are likely. Death can occur with very little violence and may indeed not be intended. A strong grip of this kind may cause death from vagal inhibition or cerebral anemia, not asphyxia. Do you understand the terms I've used? And of course, no human being talks that way. Not even when they're well prepared for a class in front of students on forensics. They're certainly not off the cuff when asked a question by an innocent, well-meaning sergeant. But that's the nature of dumping exposition, is that you get passages like that. And they peter out about at the halfway point, because P.D. James might have a weakness for padding her books, but she is a fantastic writer. She knows when it's time to get down to business, when it's time to get down to brass tacks and start ratcheting up the tension. And she does that in a number of ways in this book. I don't want to give anything away. It's all really well done, really, really well done. I myself don't see any difference in terms of execution between the latest Dalgliesh novels and the earliest ones. This author, I don't think, ever went to her writing table without being ready. I never let anything go to her publisher without it being ready. But one of the complications that she uses to ratchet up the tension in the second half of this book was a little unwelcome when I was reading it. I was just rereading it. Oh, the bean! She introduces a miniature schnauzer. No, she has Dalgliesh get sick with SARS. I was reading this thing to escape from the SARS variant epidemic that is sweeping the world. I dove into this thing to escape from that. And I was escaping just fine on an isolated island off the Cornish coast until the main character gets SARS. It was handled really well. It still ends up being a really, really good conclusion. When you strip away all of the literary flourishes and the padding, you get a standard skeleton of a murder mystery where the clues are there. The reader of this book can make a real good stab at guessing the eventual resolution of the plot. The reader can do a real good job of that. Might even get it on the nose. That is the classic we've seen on March Mystery Madness. We've seen that is the classic dictum of the classic murder mystery, is that there shouldn't be anything hidden from the reader. The reader should, if they're paying excellent attention and making the right connections, they should be able to figure it out. And I feel certain that I read this when it first came out, and I don't remember anything about it. I'm guilty of that same thing that all mystery writers are, where you don't remember, and you come back to it, and then you're on page 50 or 80, and you think, oh, this does seem familiar. But I feel certain that I would be able to figure this out. I feel certain that those clues are there. I'm not particularly good at doing that kind of figuring out, but I don't want to be either. I don't want these books ruined. But that is your Reading Vermont, not Reading Vermont. I have nothing against Reading Vermont, but this is Reading Vermont. I'm just going to make my way through the pile of those books. So I have no idea what the next one will be, but we will reconvene when I get to the next one, and we'll talk about it. Until that pile is gone. Oh my, I don't want to think about that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.